Good morning to the Sportsfan Radio panel, and as usual, there's plenty happening in sport, not the least of which is Gill McLachlan's huge goodbye tour. He was supposed to be going last year. Now it's after the gather round, aptly named. John, a few newspaper articles this week trumpeting about what he's done since he's been at the AFL. Do you think he's leaving the place better than when he found it?
I don't, Mark. I'm not with the big parade with the handsome one. I don't think the game is in the greatest shape, to be honest. Look, there's no doubt there's been some improvements during his tenure, and some fabulous, innovations. Of course, the women's game being one of them. But as I've always maintained, it wasn't Gill that got the women's game. In fact, the AFL has really been holding it back. Holding back what is a tide of interest in a game for 50% of the population of Australia. So I don't give him the credit for doing that. But look, in a sense that nothing's gone dramatically, terribly wrong, in the sense that the television rights are clearly going well, sure, he has to be congratulated. But really, the mark of any successful CEO is not how good you are, but it's how good you groom your successor. And if that was the main tick of approval for your CEO, well, he's failed miserably. Particularly when you see there's really no CEO, there's no general manager of football. We've got a dysfunctional commission with no AFL players on the commission, 2 vacancies, a chair that clearly knows nothing about football, in my opinion. He's got so much on his plate that he can't devote much time. And so we get a lot of platitudes. The real game is the supporters. And I think the support for the game is brilliant. And that's, I know Paul's going to disagree with this, but I happen to think it's the best football game in the world. So it bloody well ought to be successful, particularly after 3 years of COVID, where we're now back on track. Gelding.
Is there any word on a successor?
It's Andrew Dillon, but that's only come from this show, Paul. We've been saying that for a long time. Can I just tell you why I think Andrew Dillon will? Nobody else could do the job, because the head of the CEO, so the head of the AFL, the CEO is really managing thousands and thousands of contracts, which is the way the AFL works. It's basically a contractual hydra. So I think he will be, but no, I understand they're doing a final round of interviews. But to be honest, it's coming out through the media, which is always bad. I don't get the sense that they're anywhere close to getting a CEO.
Well, I think the 2 big contracts he has to negotiate, whoever he or she is that comes in, is the ones with the big betting companies. Because I saw some pressure during the week about banning ads and cutting back on the spending. We had Tim Costello talking about that very topic, but that would surely be tied into the money that's coming into the game. And if the advertising is going to stop, you'd have to think that the 2 biggest supporters of the AFL wouldn't want to spend as much as they are, and they're probably already committed to spending that money. So that could be the 2 biggest contracts that have to be challenged by the successor.
Yeah. John, I'd like to thank you for trying to introduce me before Giraffe decided to talk over the top of us all. But, we used to that for a while. But I did notice you twice say, Gelding, what do you want to say? And Paul decided to speak for me. But, yeah, thanks for that.
Well done, Paul.
Didn't hear that here.
Yeah. John, I'd say, really, what has he done right? Like, he's negotiated big payouts for TV rights, but everyone's getting that in all the major sports everywhere. He's been 2IC or number 1 for multiple years. He's the Essendon drug saga, he was 2IC. He's supposed to be the deal maker in all of that. That was an absolute mess. Women's football, it's just tokenism. They're just giving it a thing there. You have this Hawthorn problem now that he was going to solve before he went on his grand tour that ended up in the Super Bowl, which I still don't know why he needed that trip. But so that's there. to go to the football now, you've got to be a multi-millionaire to sit down and buy some food or drink or to get in. He's made the grand final just super corporate so supporters can't go. I reckon there's an argument to say he's absolutely stuffed it up and been no good. Yeah. You have people in the media who you've got a question about where their loyalties lie, whether they're just patting him on the back. It just seems I've got to give myself a good reference as I leave the AFL. Can you name anything apart from the football rights that he's done? This great deal maker. Tasmania's still up in the air. That's been going on for years.
Well, Tasmania's a basket case,
Yeah, women's football, tokenism. I think he's been a fairly ordinary CEO, and he took over from the fairly ordinary one.
The gambling's, I think it's fascinating because the AFL being the woke organisation that they are and that they seem to be, they have to denigrate or have to downplay gambling, but that they will say it's a beast and it's a horrible beast, but it's a beast that they don't need to feed, and they're feeding that beast, and they're doing it. I think quite transparently that it is becoming, it's infecting our game, it's infesting our game, and I hate it. And I'm not sure how handsome Gill is going to really deal with that, because they need the revenue and the interest in the game generated by the gambling. All the kids now, cash back, and they all know about it. But it's a horrible thing, and I just don't think he's got the wit to be able to manage that beast. I really do, and I think, or don't, and I think that the commission is just not leading the way at all.
That's where I wonder how much of it. Sorry, you go, Gelding.
Yeah, I just think it's quite dysfunctional. Thanks, Paul. I'll close up now. You've got the forum. Go right ahead.
Give me a cue. All right. I just wonder how much has already been invested by the gambling companies, which would be prefaced on them having a certain amount of marketing spend, or how much and when it's to be renegotiated, because that's going to be a large part of the revenue if they're not able to advertise as much as they want, because I can't imagine them just playing ball and happy to advertise more outside kid hours, if we call it that. So if you want the gambling money, you're going to have to be saturated with the advertising.
Well, isn't it the perfect game for gambling, Paul? It's a good game. It's well recognised. It'll probably be the highest profile sport in Australia. It's got so many angles that you can gamble on. When you think of what can happen in the game of AFL, there's a lot of aspects to it. It's a very unpredictable game, and so I would have thought as a gambling sport, you almost couldn't get a better one than AFL.
Well, they're going to get more of the novelty bets. I mean, with the Super Bowl, you could bet on how long the bloke was going to sing the Star Spangled Banner for. And I thought as a country and western singer, he might build it out a bit slower. But, so it's amazing the amount of novelty bets. But I did hear once cricket in India, it's all off market and black market. They bet on every ball there, and it's just insane amounts of money bet on every ball in that Big Bash or the IPL equivalent there. But you just wonder where they can go to from here, because it surely can't get much more saturated. As you say, it's a 3-hour game. I don't know whether the live betting's really taken off, because they're not allowed to publish the odds anymore as much. So I don't know whether that's taken off as much as they might have hoped. But it's a 3-hour game. Rugby league's 2 hours. That gives you another hour to gamble on for those so inclined. So it's a worry for the sport.
Tell me this, Judge. The majority of the AFL clubs who were invested in poker machines have all withdrawn from that form of gambling and were congratulated by Tim Costello for doing that. And we've had Tim on this show about the problems of gambling, and especially with children or, junior people. Why is it that the AFL seem to be going in exactly the opposite direction?
It's funny, Professor, they are, but playing that politically correct game that they do, you wouldn't know it. You would think that somehow there's this gremlin that's crept into the game and it pops up and occasionally, and it's something out external to the AFL. But of course, the AFL is clearly heavily involved in the whole thing. So it's just, I think, just the way that it presents that the AFL comes out of squeaky clean. But I think, and I noticed there was a survey recently about what really gets up the gander of supporters, that supporters are awake to this and they don't like it. And I think the counter-attack will come from the parents particularly, and other people of good sense that can see the evils that come about from gambling.
Professor, have all clubs got out of the pokies?
No, they haven't. There's still two involved.
I would have thought Hawthorn were fairly involved still out near the back of VFL Park in the shopping centre there.
Yeah, there are still two clubs. There's still two clubs involved in poker machines. All the rest are out.
Okay. And what about interstate clubs? Do we know? Does that include interstate clubs?
As I understand it, that includes interstate clubs. So,
Professor, a point I didn't raise before was that almost half the clubs in the AFL are on a lifeline from the AFL to keep them going. And were it not for the bounty from the broadcasting rights, we would actually have, I suspect, 5 clubs that are technically bankrupt, insolvent right now. So is that a strong position? I don't know.
I don't think it is a strong position. Another thing, John, for something that's been dragging on, and the Tasmanian saga, if we want to call it that, tends to hold front of mind for everybody because it seems to regularly pop back into the news. One thing that's really dropped out is, and as Gill McLachlan talked about it when he was interviewed last week, the Hawthorn thing. He called it the Hawthorn thing. Now, if you were one of the complainants in that morass, Judge, and you heard it described as a thing, I think, you'd be pretty disappointed. You'd also be pretty disappointed. The thing seems to be moving at glacial speed.
It is, and for an organisation that prides itself on being socially conscious and has got more, as I say, contractual links with tribunals, and whenever there's a dispute, it all goes off to some body. I can't believe, as you call the glacial pace continues, and to call it a thing it's pretty disrespectful, to be honest, to the people who are involved in it. I've got to say, in relation to the wokeness of Handsome Gill, I love this line when he's responding to, while people say that we get involved in everything and every social issue, we simply say to everyone in this country that we represent you or we aspire to. I mean, is that the greatest load of BS you've ever heard from a sports administrator? He's running a game. He's not a politician. He's not, trying to coalesce the country behind a government. I don't think he represents Paul Dalligan. I don't think he represents Mark Fiorenti. A lot of other people that, just don't like the game or don't respond to the game. So it's a bit rich saying that we just represent everybody in this country. I mean, the media might love that stuff, but to me, it's a lot of nonsense.
Well, the other thing, Judge, is that, and I'll go back to the Hawthorn thing. If you say thing and don't nominate exactly what the complaint's been about, then it doesn't make as big a headline because you haven't actually said what it's all about.
Well, who they represent in that situation is the coaches involved, and I'm not sure if they represent the other end of the thing, which is the people who are, how dare they complain against the AFL?
Yeah. News that in the negotiated bargaining agreement that's going forward at the moment, they're aiming towards a split of 85% of the amount of the pool that's going to player wages, 85% to the AFL, 15% to AFLW. Do you think that's reasonable? As always with those things, Professor, the devil's in the detail. I would suspect, because I honestly consider the AFL to be a quasi-political organisation these days. They picked up the political spin, which is you throw the figures out. We'll work out later on how we actually deal with it. But it's like, you receive 20% of the profits from a film and
films don't make profits because they've got creative accountants working out that you don't. So I'll have to see the detail. But I maintain, and I'll say for the 100th time, Professor, the women's game really should dissociate from the men's game. And we will see a magnificent product if the women run it.
I would have thought 75-25 would have been a better split, given that the AFL players actually do play more than double the amount of matches that the women play at the moment.
Yep.
I think 85-15 is probably a bit light.
Sounds like to me, but as I say, I don't believe the figures anyway.
Yeah. All right. Enough of AFL. Paul, let's turn to a league that's actually started playing meaningful games. Round 2, but before we get to what was happening on the field, Phil Gould's comments that putting the independent doctor in the bunker is an abomination against rugby.
The greatest abomination perpetrated on our game in history. Gee.
I was just going to say that's what needs to be said, is that he's stated, and it's quite a game full of scandals that fills a large part of our show, to call it the greatest abomination. I would say it's his head's exploded, but given we're talking about concussion, probably not a wise saying, but I think he has lost the plot. Peter Fitzsimons I don't often agree with, regularly don't agree with, but he wonders if he's lost the plot. He is incredibly powerful in rugby league. He does make a good point, and it's a very difficult scenario, but my views are the same as Peter Fitzsimons. It's where there's concussion involved, we should err on the side of caution. There seems to be a lot of criticism that this club doctor, that the doctor is independent and not a club doctor. Well, I've just got to take you back to the Rabbitohs premiership win. The first tackle, Sam Burgess had 8 bones broken in his face, and yet the Rabbitohs club doctor, and sorry, Sam, but to my eternal gratitude, sent him back on. There is no way known that man was fit to play football. He won us that match with half a face, and obviously concussed. So if the independent doctor was in now, the Rabbitohs wouldn't have won that premiership. And I think it is arbitrary in some ways, but they are a trained, independent medical professional. You can't have clubs making the decision. There has been a proposal that you can see already that some clubs may seek to manipulate this and try and take out the best player, because the worst that can happen, well, if they take the player out, he'll be sent off. In days gone by, he might have played on and won the match. Andrew Johns says he doesn't remember a lot of the wins he had because he'd been hit. Now he'd be off the field. So the possible proposal is that whoever is the aggressor is also sent off. But I can already answer that this way, is the aggressor wouldn't be as good a player as the person being taken out, because the person being taken out is the best player, generally. Or the playmaker, or the guy, like, for example, it'd be Cameron Munster, or it'd be Jack Whiten for the Raiders. You'd get some meathead from the other team just almost sent out with the code red to injure them, to make sure they get sent off. So I can't see a way around this, but we need to err on the side of caution.
Paul, can you just give us a bit of background? What is the independent doctor? Is it for every game? And are these independent doctors actually familiar with the game of rugby and the sort of injuries to expect?
Well, no, they're not even at the game, and that's caused a lot of controversy. They're watching in almost a bunker in another location, but they're watching for the signals of concussion. So I don't know whether you need to necessarily be a rugby league expert. There's been, what set Phil Gould off and has set off, as 5 coaches already have come out against it, is the player has said they're fine. Well, you're already noticing when players do get concussed, they're acting like they're not. They already know that they can't act in any way to be unsteady on their feet or slow off the ground or slurring or the eyes darting around. So it's almost like the players are trying to avoid being dragged off, but it's an independent tap on the head as opposed to a club doctor who normally does the concussion tests on the field. But you can't have club doctors who have an immediate conflict making a decision on whether the best player should be out there or not. Of course, they're going to let them stay out there. And that's just unfortunately part of the game. So I'm all for it, but it is seemed to be arbitrary. It may be that they need to refine their skills and perhaps get someone with more expertise perhaps in concussion, but it does seem that there's players being hauled off when they're not concussed, but that's surely a lot better than players staying out there when they are concussed and could risk permanent damage.
Paul, how many people actually listen to Gould anymore? Like, I know when I have the State of Origin on, I just turn it off because he's so biased, one way in New South Wales way and all that. And his opinion is always, to one side, and we can see what he's doing to the Professor's Bulldogs over there, he just seems one of these people that all sports have them, is just the mouth, go to the quote and say something to get themselves in the headlines.
Well, I mean, Peter Fitzsimons, you'd have to say he's the straightest shooter we've had since Michael Diamond. He even said that he enjoys Gus Gould's insight. So I've got to say, I don't mind his commentary. He knows the game back to front, but he is prone to these type of, again, I won't say brain explosions, but to just moments where it just all takes him over, because he is passionate for the game, but he can come out with some absolute shocking comments. But I don't think that should judge his entire knowledge of rugby league, and he's certainly a power broker. No one else could have, I don't think, got the Bulldogs to where they are, which is on the up, as we saw and we'll talk about. I don't mind his commentary. There are better, I think, and he can be very biased. But when he's objective, which he's not with New South Wales and he's not with concussion, he can be one of the worth listening to. But that's just me.
Okay, Paul, let's look at round 2. Kicked off Thursday night. Your Rabbitohs playing at the foot of the mountain against the Panthers. What did you think about the game?
Oh, South tried, but the Panthers' class just prevailed. I mean, they had some injuries and we just couldn't quite get there. And we are the bridesmaid story at the moment for the last 5 years, prelims. So we just didn't quite have the class to overcome the Panthers, and it was an opportunity gone begging, unfortunately. They're still the favourites to win it all, Penrith. Pretty comfortable favourites as well.
Did you get anything out of the first Friday night game, the Eels' second loss? They're winless, sitting at 15th on the table. The Sharks overcoming them in the end, 30-26.
I'd have to check my top 8 prediction, but I'm not sure where I had the Eels finishing, but they're slipping right down in the rankings and the bookmakers' odds to win it all. They're not in the top 8 anymore. Losing 2 games in such a close competition will do that to you. I tipped the Sharks to finish quite highly, and I think they're a very real threat of winning it all, the Sharks. They're very well coached. They've got the best player in the game, or one of them, in Nico Hines. I really think they're a smoky to win it all, the Sharks.
You had the Sharks at 5, the Eels at 6.
Okay, well, there you go. I might revise the Eels slightly down. I still think the Eels will fight back. There's been a lot of disharmony there because of the half situation, but they still haven't yet signed up Mitchell Moses, who's being offered a king's ransom to go to West Tigers, where he started his career. The longer it goes on, the more I think that he may be off to the Tigers. I thought he was signed at the Eels, but I might be wrong.
And the other Friday night game, the Broncos now won 2 in a row and sitting currently second on the ladder. Took care of the Cowboys quite nicely.
It's very good for rugby league, and we'll talk about the fantastic job that Wayne Bennett's done at the Dolphins, but firing Broncos is great for the game. They're the biggest club, and it is fantastic for rugby league that the Broncos are up and about. It's a really good, and the Cowboys, they'll be there, but the Broncos surprised many. I thought the Cowboys would win that match, but the Broncos were very impressive.
Now, look at yesterday's games. Let's talk about the Dolphins first. 2 in a row, took care of the Raiders. I don't think anybody had them sitting top of the ladder at this time in the season.
Well, can I give you a question without notice, Professor? In over 100 years of rugby league and 23 expansion teams, how many do you think have kicked off 2-0?
None, except the Dolphins.
No, 3. So we had the Storm and the Broncos. Did you have anything to say, Gelding? I didn't want to cut you off. I didn't give you a chance.
No. We normally allocate 45 minutes of the 1 hour show to you, Paul.
Okay. I'll try and talk a bit quicker. It was fantastic, though, to see, and it's great for the game, and perhaps shows how, without a dig at the AFL with Tasmania, it shows how a new club can be introduced and can be successful. And it's great to see.
Sorry, Paul, how big's the stadium for the Dolphins?
Oh, they're playing mostly at Suncorp, which is, I think, one of the best stadiums in the country for rugby league. And when they play the Broncos, I think that's in 2 weeks' time, they will be lined up about a week out to see that game. Their home stadium isn't large, but they play their bigger games at Suncorp, and the Redcliffe area is just north of Brisbane. So it's a fantastic venue. They've got the platform there, and they're going to very quickly become everyone's second team.
Mm.
Paul, they could go to 3-0 next week. They've got the Knights.
I saw that, yeah. And then after that, the Broncos, which they'll be very fired up for. So if they do beat the Knights, which I expect them to next week, that will be one of the biggest rugby league games in years. Brisbane and the new boys, if they're 3-0.
And the Raiders off to a very bad start, zip 2.
Yep, some troubles there, and we have to worry about Ricky Stewart as well. He could go nuclear. He already is, I think, starting to show us some signs. So it won't be long till he's putting 10 grand or more into the bank account of the NRL with a fine, I wouldn't think.
Well, they've got the Sharks this coming week, so they could be 0-3.
It likely will be. But then again, last year they came home like a steam train. So don't write them off, but it's a very close competition to be getting behind. And if we jump into the Storm, that was we were there last year, weren't we, Professor, when the Dogs got absolutely smashed by the Storm. To think within a year they could come back and win 26-12, just an amazing turnaround.
Well, Paul, I've got to say that game slipped under my guard. I didn't realise, I said to Gelding on yesterday's That's Racing, that I didn't realise that the Bulldogs were playing so early in the season against the Storm. And then I looked at it and I thought, after last week's, I said, I'm glad I'm not going anyway. And then I saw the result at the end of the game and I thought, geez, I wish I had have gone.
Well, Josh Addo-Carr enjoyed coming home. He ran for over 200 metres. I think 7 tackle bursts, I think it was, which is just amazing against the Storm defence. And Jacob Carraz, not a well-known name, but if he keeps playing like that, he could be pushing for State of Origin duties. He ran for over 200 metres against that Storm defence. So Craig Bellamy, not surprisingly, roasted his team. I don't like that he does that, publicly roasts his team. That's his style. I'd rather keep it behind closed doors, but his style is a blowtorch, and he's got it out this week. He's certainly been firing away at his squad.
It's not often in the post-coaches press conference in any sport, in any code, where the coach will sit there and say, well, we got what we deserved.
And he said they weren't putting in effort. I think that's a very quick way to drive a wedge. I mean, I think it's his last year, so it's probably a bit late to worry about his style. But to say that they're not putting effort in when you're playing for the Melbourne Storm, that is a very inflammatory statement. I just think they lost to a very good Dogs team who has a lot of arsenal and a lot of firepower, and they played very well. I think it wouldn't be bad for Bellamy sometimes to just give credit where it's due, as opposed to thinking blasting his team's the best way out of it.
And another pickup from this year, from over the off-season, Reid Mahoney played very well as well.
He did, and I think your Dogs are certainly on the up. They had a very different style of game. The Storm have the worst injuries in their history, but I guess credit to Bellamy for not blaming that as an excuse, but he roasted the players that were out there. I really think it's exciting times for you Dogs, Professor, and it's good to see.
Paul, just slightly off that, can I ask you for your comments? What was in the papers during the week and today was about the proposal for a 20-league team in the NRL. The Australian Rugby League's put this forward that they're behind it, and Peter V'landys says it's all worthwhile. Confirmed high-level talks were held for a 20-team league as an annual general meeting of the clubs. He's looking forward to it and believes it should certainly be looked at.
Did they say where that? I haven't seen that, but where the teams would be?
Yeah, at least one in Adelaide, Paul, is part of the plan, which surprised me.
From where?
Yeah, a significant expansion. News Corp, the Rooster Supremo Nick Paulettis is behind a $400 million master plan for the NRL to take over the AFL as number one football code by adding 3 new teams, possibly before the 2032 Brisbane Olympics. They're talking about one team being out, the 18th team being out of Cairns, and not much has gone forward since that.
No, and if they're looking at Perth and Adelaide, that's tried and not succeeded. I would certainly be keeping it the way it is. I'm all for expansion, but careful expansion. As we saw with the Dolphins, that was a very measured and sensible addition. I think if they just start throwing darts at the national dartboard, they're not going to stick. I'm surprised by that. I thought that they had the right strategy in place, which is cautious expansion.
I didn't
Weren't
know
they
this.
going up through Samoa and getting a lot of those kind of people involved maybe as well? But anyway,
Yeah, well,
that's something.
there's been talk for a while about a Papua New Guinea team, and that's just a country absolutely obsessed with rugby league. But I just don't. I think that'd be less viable than the Tasmanian option. So I just don't. I think they should just try and build on what they've got. Try and build the Titans first up. Try and get some support into the Gold Coast. Let's see them succeed before you start adding more Queensland teams.
All right, Paul, let's look at today's games. The 4:05 game, Wests and the Knights, both very disappointing teams in the first round, but at least one of them will end up with the points after today's game.
Well, I was going to say that both of the games today I don't think would win any new fans to rugby league. They're not exactly what our friend Mark Theorent used to call mouth-watering clashes, but maybe for the purists. But I think that the Tigers should have too much, surely. They've been disappointing this year. The exact opposite of seeing your Dogs. I can't see them rising like the Dogs, but they should beat the Knights today. The Knights have become too heavy on Kalen Ponga, and the Tigers should mark him out of the game. I think the Tigers should win that fairly comfortably.
And the Titans looking to go 2-0 for the first time for a considerable period of time.
Well, interestingly, Ben Hunt, the skipper of the Dragons, has insisted, Kevin Yapstyle, that they won't get the wooden spoon. I find that surprising because given their only real rival was considered to be the Dolphins for the spoon, I think there's a spoon headed to the Wollongong area, and I think the Titans should win. They've got a lot of class in that Titans team. Dragons just a rabble. That's the first coach who will be sacked. I said at the start of the year, the Dragons coach.
And what do you think the score will be in the West Knights game, Paul?
22-10. I think the Tigers will win. And the Titans, I'll go for 16-12 in a close one against the Dragons. Hopefully it's a better game than it looks on paper. I'm sorry, Professor, but I'll tell it how it is. Just not I think the Titans, I'd love to see them do well this year, but the excitement in Brisbane and around that area is obviously the Broncos and the Dolphins.
All right, Paul, let's wrap up NRL with this one that I read during the week, that the Roosters are approaching their Adam Reynolds moment, with Tedesco and Suwali both coming up for contracts, and Suwali wanting to play fullback, and 2-1 position won't go.
It won't. And the main number you need to look at, the 10-year age difference. And I think, unfortunately, as good as Tedesco's been, they have to look at the future. And the biggest danger for the Roosters is the Wallabies, who want Suwali, as he played rugby union at school. Friends of mine who are connected in rugby said he's the best schoolboy they've seen in 30 years. So you can imagine Eddie Jones wants him playing in a Wallabies jersey for the World Cup. The Roosters will have to sort the Tedesco situation out. But I don't think anything's going to stop Suwali playing number one, unfortunately, for James Tedesco.
So your early call is that Tedesco will be the casualty?
He will be, and he'll probably go to the West Tigers on enormous money and see out his career there. And you could call that a win-win for all parties, because Suwali's the future at number one for the Roosters. Right, as sad as it is, your loyalty only lasts so long in any sport.
Well, and especially how good a player he is and has been.
That's right, but there's the time for everyone. If you don't call the curtain on your career, someone else will. And this is one of the hottest prospects seen in many years. So that's who'll bring the curtain down on a very good career at the Roosters.
Will Tedesco be captain for the New South Wales Origin team?
He would likely be, this year. He'd have to get in on form, though. There's a lot of good fullbacks around, but he'll likely be one of the first picked. He's a great player, but again, he's 32 and Suwali's 22. So that's the big difference. Oh, he's younger than that even. That's the big difference, is unfortunately he's just got such a good player underneath him as his understudy.
Mm-hmm. All right, Paul, thanks for the NRL wrap up today. Much appreciated. John, you wanted to talk about AFLW games being commentated by women.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Sometimes I feel I'm a bit of a voice in the wilderness here, but I honestly believe that women, they do life differently, they do sport differently, and it's no surprise they do Australian rules football differently. And I think as the game is sort of now progressing to a mature level, I think it's 8 seasons in, it's starting to develop its own meter, its own way of doing things. And what really got me thinking about it, Mark, was I watched some of the pre-season stuff of the AFL, the men's, and Daisy Pearce was commentating, and I just noticed that she's morphing into that, can I say, the male way of commentating, using expressions that the blokes have used for years. It's a fairly, I don't know how you describe it, but I call it an aggressive way of commentating. And it's a fairly, I don't think it sort of suits her. And I just think that if women had their own commentating team, commentating on a game that they know, and I'd argue that the women's game is actually subtly different from the men's game, that they would get into their own rhythm. They'd be commentating to an audience that clearly likes the women's game, and I can only imagine that that's primarily women. And I think it would over time be compatible with the developments in the women's game at the same time. So over, say, a 10-year period, we really would have a demarcation between the way the women's game is played, administered, and as I've said before, I wish the women's game would separate from the AFL, and also how it's commentated. I've never been a big believer in, like netball, for instance, has had male commentators, and I always thought it was rather odd, unless the men actually play the game at a very high level. So it seems to be that the broadcasters think we have to have a male in there, getting the male voice in there, because another one of my beliefs, Professor, is that men react differently to the female voice than they do to the male voice, and vice versa. And I actually did a bit of research, and apparently there's a bit in that men actually react on a general basis differently to a woman's voice than a man's, and exactly the same applies to women. Not saying it's right, not saying it's better or worse, it's just different. And if I'm right that women play sport differently or do sport differently, I think it's natural that there ought to be an all-female voice in the commentary box. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think it'll happen eventually. I just wish it happened earlier, sooner rather than later.
Do you think it's possibly due to, or the lack of women in commentary boxes is due to the people who are calling the shots in most of these things are men?
Oh, no doubt about it. I actually think the women are being held back. I mean, Kelly Underwood was a trailblazer and God, we all remember the criticism, not just back in the day when she started, which I think was about 15 years ago or so. It's happening now. And it's not just the men that run the sports, it's also a lot of the male commentary from armchair viewers and listeners and social media contributors. It's just disgusting, the way that the women aren't, I think, given a fair go. And I think as a result of it, a lot of women are held back and think, oh, I won't go near that. That's just a cesspool. And so we've got to get better. But I think it does require some courageous broadcasters who say, well, this is just ridiculous. They're half the people who are interested in AFL, half of them are women. And it's always been, I think, a very nice facet of our game, that in any game, half the people in the stands are women. And now we're seeing this revolution, which we've all in this program expected, was now happening. So it makes absolute sense that women's voice should be given its time. I think that time's now.
Yeah, when I look at it, and I see the number of opportunities for women to call football games, like it's exponentially increased, especially with AFLW going to 18 teams. Like there's 9 matches every round. We haven't seen the same exponential increase in female commentators, and what really irritates me is the implication. Oh, well, look, the reason they aren't there is that they aren't really good enough to be doing it. Well, they are out there. How hard are you looking for them, though?
It actually drives me freaking nuts, Professor. And I do feel like I'm belting my head against the wall about this, but there is absolutely no reason. There's 1,000 reasons why it should be that we give a lot of women who are knowledgeable about the game, who are knowledgeable about the women's interest in the game, and I can't even pretend to say what that is, but they're there, and given a proper platform, I think we could see a really interesting, different, and in fact, good product. Sure, it's different from what we're used to. And so, maybe so you old blokes won't appreciate it. I'm not the hitting zone of women's football. I self-avowedly say that, although I used to be the lawyer for women's football, I've always appreciated, but I'm not their market. But they have got a massive potential market, particularly women, young girls who I think would really appreciate the fact that they can see and hear women's voices and get really involved in the game. And I think it's actually having men there holds that back.
Well, the other thing, Judge, is that the so-called good in inverted commas, male commentators, if I run my eye over them, there are very few.
I agree. I really agree. Yeah. And they've been around for a long time. And frankly, are showing it. Really. Anyway, without mentioning names, we all know who I'm talking about.
Yes. All right. Let's wander over across to cricket. Gelding. The final test in India. India are leading 2-1, and they've thrown up a pitch that one could describe as a roadway.
The Hume Highway, Professor. Well, we've mentioned it before. International cricket authorities seem to be beholden to Indian cricket, and Indian cricket seem to be able to do what they want. The first 3 test wickets weren't up to test standards. And by that, we saw tests ending in 3 days, Professor. Then we had the fast of this 4th test. I think they prepared 3 test wickets and didn't decide till the very last minute which one they were going to use, Professor. And we've gone from a spinning wicket to, as you've said, a highway. And runs are certainly flowing. So, look, I would imagine, can't see anything bar this one being a draw, Professor. India 3 down for 280, still need another, 200 runs, but I think they'll bat for most of the day today. Hopefully Virat Kohli can get his first ton for something like 3 years in Test cricket, but I thought the good reason for him not making a ton is because he's got to bat on those Indian wickets, Professor, that turn right ways. So, look, you can only play on what's presented, but the bowling attacks, I don't know. Our selection have got to be considered, I suppose. Green as an opening bowler when you've got Boland sitting there. That's gone through the whole series. I think we name a test where we think the selection has been wrong in each of these tests. And, I wonder what this preparation is going to be like for when we go across to England, where instead of getting dust bowls and spinning wickets will get sleeping wickets. So very interesting, Professor.
Well, that's a good segue, Gelding. You've talked about the coming Ashes series in England a little bit later in the year. Has Usman Khawaja done enough in this Test series to pen his name into one of the opening berths for the Ashes series?
I would like to see the two openers at the moment, Khawaja and Head, go across. David Warner hasn't got a very good record in Test cricket in England. Apart from a 200 in Melbourne, hasn't really done much this season. Did nothing in India before all of a sudden decided to come home.
Gelding, there's no way that Warner can go across, is there?
Sorry?
There's no way that Warner can go to England, surely. Take away that 200, and I saw that innings, but take that away, gee, it's been a pretty dismal patch for the last, 3 years or so?
Yep, spot on, Judge. He has been struggling. You know, he's been making some runs, but not the big scores and not what we needed. And remember, that 200 was against South Africa. We played West Indies, South Africa, who are rated way down there as far as Test nations at the moment. But look, I think Warner's time's passed, and it'll be very interesting because I did notice during the week I was reading that the Australian annual cricket contracts are due next week. Now, Warner's in the top 5 of Australian players that have been paid. You've got Cummings up there, Stark up there, Smith and Josh Hazlewood. Now, Smith hasn't done a terrible lot over in India. As we said, Warner's hasn't done much. Hazlewood's been injured for most of the summer and this series. Mitchell Stark and Pat Cummins haven't really set things alight, have they, in the last couple of series? We've dominated against the lower sides with bowling and that. So, Khawaja.
I'm surprised the Labuschagn's not involved in that.
One's moving up.
Sorry, Phil, just surprised the Labuschagn's not in the top 5. Would you?
Yeah, well, remember when these were done. So Labuschagne and Khawaja would probably be moving up. And these others may have to be interesting to see how that affects the egos and whether that brings on some earlier retirements into the one-day game.
Gelding, I have to say, after the Indies series, in terms of preparation for the English series, I've got no idea of the form line for Australia, both in the batting and the bowling. It is all over the shop.
Modern-day cricket. John, I was reading an article about the Sheffield Shield, which the last game's about to start, and it was commentating that the New South Wales captain, Curtis Patterson, has been dropped from the New South Wales side. And he was the last Test batsman to come through what has been a production line of the New South Wales cricket batsmen. But just no one seems to be coming through this at the moment. Where's the pressure for these young batsmen to come in?
Just a total off the page, Professor. We like the question without notice in the show. Gelding, of all the batsmen who ever played Test cricket, with innings of have played more than 30 innings, after Bradman, who's got the highest Test average?
Of all Test players?
All Test players of all countries. And let me tell you, no, it is an Australian though, and this goes back to when the records began. So, who do you reckon?
Oh well, you've got me on this one. Go on, Warwick Armstrong.
No, Professor.
No.
Who do you reckon?
I'm very quick on a computer. Adam Voges.
Adam Voges. I think that surprised most people. Who comes after him? Graham Pollock, for instance.
Yes.
Well, anyway, I was amazed by that.
Yeah.
He goes
I would
lots of his-
imagine Van Duker would have to be up there.
No,
John.
not anywhere near. And
Not anywhere
goes,
near.
Professor. It just shows you how you can fiddle stats. He's not outs. He's not outs. Where you compare that to Bradman. Bradman had 8 times more when he went out, and Voges just so that really fiddles with your stats when you haven't gone out.
The red inks are always very handy to improve your average, John.
Well,
I can remember a lot of playing a fair bit of cricket. There has been some blokes generally known to try to go for the red inks to win batting averages.
Well, in fact, I think the stats should be changed to just those who have gone out and get their stats. And you look at Voges, you'd be nowhere near it. You'd be down to 30s. It's in the 60s.
That's
61.
fantastic. And that's over 30 tests. You would have got me that he wouldn't have played 30
I think
tests.
it's 31 innings, actually.
Yeah,
31.
30.
Yeah.
It's an if you've played in excess of 30 innings.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Now, Voges played 20 tests. His highest score was 269. Now, if you had have asked me what Adam Voges' highest score was, I never would have got anywhere near 269. But
Not
that
out.
was 200. That was 269 not out.
Yeah, yeah.
And he had 7 not outs in 31 innings,
Yeah.
which gave him 61.87. But he did have 5 100s and 4 50s in those 31 innings. So 5 100s isn't too bad for a limited number of innings. Now, the highest current player for Australia is Steve Smith, 59.74.
Mm.
Well, yeah, Laverger's and Smith's averages have taken a big tumble over in India.
Yes,
Yeah. Anyway,
definitely, Gelding.
throw that in.
All right. Well, now,
So, Professor, looking for the cricket, a fair bit happening. You have the Sheffield Shield final last round, and then the finals coming up. Victoria sitting in 3rd position. However, in the last game play, they're 1 point behind Queensland to get into the final, but unfortunately we play the top side Western Australia over there, so maybe a bit hard. As we said, contracts are up. The IPL starts very, very soon over there. Once the women's IPL starts, the Australian women's cricketers are excelling in the women's IPL. We have the last of the test, and with an Ashes series coming up, a lot happening in cricket. Maybe Cricket Australia might let the side have a bit of a warm-up over in England and maybe play a couple of games against county sides that used to happen.
that'd be a good idea, Gelding.
Geez, do you reckon they'd be able to do? But I don't think it'll be happening.
All right, Gelding. Now, while I've got you there, racing, and you'll like this one, Judge. Somebody's misfortune is quite often somebody else's good fortune. Now, there was misfortune yesterday. There was a fall in one of the races. Craig Williams suffered a fractured clavicle and some concussion, and Jamie Carr had a terrible concussion. Both riders dislodges, but the good news was the 2 horses are okay. But Dean Holland, a 32-year-old jockey who went to the course yesterday with a couple of rides, didn't have a ride in the Newmarket, but was one of the few jockeys who could ride at the weight of 51.5 kilos. So Jamie Carr couldn't ride. So Dean Holland did. His horse won. His share of the winnings, $45,250, which he had no idea he was going to win at the start of the day.
Professor, in secret, a tip that was on That's Racing yesterday. Just a funny banter. Professor, hunters always talk through their pockets. There I was, as you said, I liked In Secret and I tipped it, and I took it at 440 when Jamie Carr was on it. Once she had a fall and Dean Holland was on board, punters reacted and started and paid $6.80. So we've taken the shorts at 440, Professor, but as I said, not complaining because I'm happy that we've won. But reading reports this morning on Craig Williams and Jamie Carr. Good news. Jamie Carr is suffering a very severe concussion. However, scans have revealed no brain injury or no fractures. So that's good news initially, but let's wait and see what comes of it. And Craig Williams has a fractured collarbone, a concussion, and also fractured fingers, and maybe a couple of fractured ribs, Professor. So a nasty fall, following a nasty fall the week before with Ethan Brown. So, yeah, maybe the stewards might start acting now when some of these jockeys go for runs that aren't there. But we'll see what happens, Professor.
Interestingly, Gelding, Dean Holland's got a 9% win rate over his career, which isn't isn't in the stellar area where you'd expect to be riding a horse like In Secret, but he got the ride simply because he was one of the few jockeys who could ride the way.
Yeah, Professor, not too many races where there's normally a 54 limit in Victoria, but in these handicaps it gets right down. So very few jockeys can ride at that weight. And of course, some of those other jockeys that had rides were already taken up on other horses. But look, he rode the horse perfectly. He would best be described as a journeyman, Professor. Very much like Sportsfan Radio's own Craig Robinson. These guys go to, put in plenty of miles to ride. He's off tomorrow to Adelaide to ride in the Adelaide Cup. So, look, he does a lot of travelling, a lot of reward for a reasonably competent jockey that does a lot of riding. And I know I'd certainly be happy with him riding my horse, Professor. But
there's no chance you ride your horse today, Gelding.
No, agree with that, Professor. But yeah, look, sensational for Dean Holland, and I thought he was very respectful in his speech after he's won. He said he was going to keep his celebrations very low key because of what had happened, before the race and the injury to his fellow jockeys.
All right, Gelding, there's races at Echuca and Stony Creek today. Let's round out the show with your selections.
Well, Professor, of course, have an interest going around in race 6, number 6, Drop the Mic at Echuca. Trainer Delusional, I think, going to this race. We're up against horses with the classes above us, but hoping for hopefully we could run 3rd or 4th, Professor. This race is worth 125,000. Excuse me. And surprisingly is worth more than the Echuca Cup, Professor, which is only worth 100,000.
Well, nice race to be involved in, Gelding.
Yeah. Sorry, Professor. Maybe some tips for Echuca. Race 2, number 3, Guzmo. Dean Yendall to ride. Into race 5, number 5, Lempickner, a Paddy Maloney ride. I think he'll do very well in that. And look, Professor, I'll wait for race 6, but I'll leave the Cup alone. But I do like a few at Stony Creek today, Professor. Race 2, number 10, Zaseed. Race 3, number 11, Misspoke. Race 6, number 2, Italian Poet. And race 8, number 4, 100%.
All right, Gelding, thanks for those. I've got a note of them, and the best wishes for Drop the Mic today in race 6 at Echuca. It's raced there that many times, Gelding, it'll have frequent flyer miles.
Well, Professor, I don't mind it racing at Echuca. It's had 4 starts up there for 3 wins. So
And are you going up to have a look at it?
No, Professor. I thought the horse was entered for Sandown last Wednesday, and I thought we might have made an appearance out at Sandown, but I don't think I'm up to driving 3.5 hours up the highway, watch a race, and then drive 3.5 hours back.
Yeah, it might be a bridge too far, Gelding.
Might be, Professor, but I also look forward to talking to you later today after the show.
Yes.
Maybe about a possible further investment in the high-risk money market.
GM Racing.
Beautiful.
All
Beautiful
right.
thing.
Thanks for your contributions today, Judge. Much appreciated as always. Thanks,
Right,
Gelding.
guys.
And good afternoon until next time we meet.
See you, boys.